I would also just like play some pool downstairs.
Well, let me get a sip of water first.
No, keep going.
I just ate so much chocolate.
Chocolate.
Yeah, let's play pool. Down for a walk.
Oh, you turned my speaker off? I didn't realize.
Yeah. We put them just like really light.
Yeah, like poker.
Nah, honestly, no music can be in the background of this.
Okay.
Poker face.
Put
I also want to read you my short story.
Okay.
It's really short, but
I'm ready. Listen.
here is Rebellion. So there are three main brothers. The oldest is 28. He's like a gambling buffoon. He goes around trying to swindle his father out of money. The father kind of abandoned all his kids, but he made a little bit of money. So the oldest is Dmitri, ex-military deadbeat, lies a lot, goes around gossiping, and he's trying to get some of his father's money when, thinks he's a bit entitled. The middle child, Ivan, is 24, and he's an intellectual. He was so abandoned by his father that he got passed around to different family members, and he had a really good elementary school teacher, inspired him to go on, learn at the university, and now he's been writing articles, and he's kind of interested in the church and clerisy and kind of church law, and he's pro-freedom, but he's kind of, so he's a little messed up in the head from his childhood. So he goes home, back to this old village. He doesn't even know his father. He's meeting him for the first time. The youngest, Alyosha, is smart but very quiet. He got passed around with his brother Ivan, so he's never met Dmitri either. He comes back to the town, and there's a monk in town, an elder Christian monk, that he starts to study under, and he's not really naive. He doesn't know what to think, but it's a good role model. And in the beginning of the book, the elder monk dies, and he was a very quiet pillar in this family because he influenced the youngest brother, who had to kind of sort through this drama about money with these drunkards, with these very volatile family members. Okay, so this scene, the youngest Alyosha, the quiet Christian one, is meeting with his brother Ivan at a bar. And Ivan is trying to challenge him on Christianity. He says, how can there be a loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God if there's so much evil in the world? And he starts telling these stories. He starts getting this off his chest to his younger brother, who he adores. He says, I must make an admission, Ivan began. I never could understand how it's possible to love one's neighbors. In my opinion, it's precisely one's neighbors that one cannot possibly love. Perhaps if they weren't so nigh... I read sometime somewhere about John the Merciful, some saint, that when a hungry and frozen passerby came to him and asked to be made warm, he laid down with him in bed, embraced him, and began breathing into his mouth, which was foul and festering with some terrible disease. I'm convinced that he did it with the strain of a lie, out of love enforced by duty, out of self-imposed penance. If we're to come to love a man, the man himself should stay hidden, because as soon as he shows his face, love vanishes. The elder Zosima has spoken of that more than once, Alyosha remarked. He also says that a man's face often prevents many people who are as yet inexperienced in love from loving him. But there is still much love in mankind, almost like Christ's love. I know that, Ivan. Well, I don't know it yet, and I cannot understand it, nor can a numberless multitude of other people along with me. The question is whether this comes from bad qualities in people or is inherent in their nature. In my opinion, Christ's love for people is in its kind a miracle impossible on earth. True, he was God, but we are not gods. Let's say that I, for example, am capable of profound suffering, but another man will never be able to know the degree of my suffering because he is another and not me. Besides, a man is rarely willing to acknowledge someone else as a sufferer. as if it were a kind of distinction. And why won't he acknowledge it, do you think? Because I, for example, have a bad smell or foolish face or once stepped on his foot. Besides, there is suffering and suffering. Some benefactor of mine may still allow a humiliating suffering, which humiliates me, hunger, for example, but a slightly higher suffering, for an idea, for example. No, that he will not allow, save perhaps on rare occasions, because he will look at me and suddenly see that my face is not at all the kind of face that, he fancies, a man should have who suffers. For example, for such and such an idea. And so he at once deprives me of his benefactions, and not even from the wickedness of his heart. Beggars, especially noble beggars, should never show themselves in the street. They should ask alms through the newspapers. It's still possible to love one's neighbor abstractly, and even occasionally from a distance, but hardly ever up close. If it were as it is on stage in a ballet, where beggars, when they appear, come in silken rags and tattered lace and ask for alms, dancing gracefully, well, then it would still be possible to admire them. To admire, but still not to love. But enough of that. I simply want to put you into my perspective. I meant to talk about the suffering of mankind in general, but better let us dwell on the sufferings of children. That will reduce the scope of my argument about 10 times, but even so, it's better if we keep the children. The more unprofitable for me, of course. But first, one can love children even up close, even dirty or homely children. It seems to me, however, that children never are homely. Second, I will not speak of grown-ups because, apart from the fact that they are disgusting and do not deserve love, they also have retribution. They ate the apple and knew good and evil, and have become as gods, as the serpent told Adam and Eve. And they still go on eating it. Little children have not eaten anything, and are not yet guilty of anything. Do you love children, Alyosha? I know you love them, and you'll understand why I want to speak only of them now. If they, too, suffer terribly on earth, it is, of course, for their fathers. They are punished for their fathers who ate the apple. But that is reasoning from another world. For the human heart here on earth, it is incomprehensible. It's impossible that a blameless one should suffer for another, and such a blameless one. Marvel at me, Alyosha. I, too, love children terribly, and observe that cruel people, passionate, carnivorous, Karamazovian, sometimes love children very, very much. Children, while they are still children, up to the age of 7, for example, are terribly remote from grown-up people, as if they were different beings, of a different nature. I knew a robber in prison. He happened in the course of his career, while slaughtering whole families in the houses he broke into and robbed at night, to have put the knife to several children as well. But he showed a strange affection for them while he was in prison. He spent all his time at the window watching the children playing in the prison yard. He even trained one boy to come to his window, and as the boy got to be very friendly with him... Do you know why I'm saying all this, Alyosha? I somehow have a headache, and I feel sad. You have a strange look as you speak, Alyosha observed anxiously, as if you were in some kind of madness. By the way, a Bulgarian I met recently in Moscow, Ivan Fyodorovich went on, as if he were not listening to his brother, told me how the Turks and Circassians there in Bulgaria have been committing atrocities everywhere, fearing a general uprising of the Slavs. They burn, kill, rape women and children. They nail prisoners by the ears to fences and leave them like that until morning.
One second. I'm sorry. I just want to say something. I really want to watch a movie, and it's like almost 9. How much longer you got left? I wanted, because dude, I thought did Shu not respond to you?
Like 2 minutes left. No, he didn't respond.
It was just starting to get good.
It was just starting to get good.
Was it? Alright. Finish that, but dude, I just want to figure out.
I want to watch this Conor McGregor documentary though.
Yeah, this is almost over.
Okay.
By the way, a Bulgarian I met recently in Moscow, Ivan Fyodorovich went on, as if he were not listening to his brother. Told me how the Turks and Circassians there in Bulgaria have been committing atrocities everywhere, fearing a general uprising of the Slavs. They burn, kill, rape women and children. They nail prisoners by the ears to fences and leave them like that until morning. And in the morning, they hang them. And so on. It's impossible to imagine it all. Indeed, people speak sometimes about the animal cruelty of man, but that is terribly unjust and offensive to animals. No animal could ever be so cruel as a man, so artfully, so artistically cruel. A tiger simply gnaws and tears. That is all he can do. It would never occur to him to nail people by their ears overnight, even if he were able to do it. These Turks, among other things, have also taken a delight in torturing children, starting with cutting them out of their mother's wombs with a dagger, and ending with tossing nursing infants up in the air and catching them on their bayonets before their mother's eyes. The main delight comes from doing it before the mother's eyes. But here is a picture that I found very interesting. Imagine a nursing infant in the arms of its trembling mother, surrounded by Turks. They've thought up an amusing trick. They fondle the baby, they laugh to make it laugh, they succeed, the baby laughs. And at that moment, a Turk aims a pistol at it, 4 inches away from its face. The baby laughs gleefully, reaches out its little hands to grab the pistol, and suddenly the artist pulls the trigger right in its face and shatters its little head. Artistic, isn't it? By the way, they say the Turks are very fond of sweets. What are you driving at, brother? Alyosha asked. I think that if the devil does not exist, and man has therefore created him, he has created him in his own image and likeness. As well as God, then. You're a remarkably good implorator of unholy suits, as Polonius says in Hamlet. Ivan laughed. So you caught me, but let it be. I'm glad. A nice God you've got, if man created him in his images and likeness. You asked me what I was driving at, you see. I'm an amateur and collector of certain little facts. I copy them down from newspapers and stories from whatever, and I save them. Would you believe it? Certain kinds of little anecdotes, and I already have a nice little collection of them. The Turks, of course, are in it, but they're for engineers. I have native specimen as well, even better than the Turkish ones. You know, with us, it's beating, the birch, and the lash. That's our national way. With us, nailed ears are unthinkable. We're Europeans, after all. But the birch, the lash, that is ours and cannot be taken from us. Abroad, they apparently no longer do any beatings nowadays. Either their morals have been purified, or they've passed such laws that apparently one man no longer dares to whip another. But they've rewarded themselves with something else to make up for it. Something as purely national as our way. So national that is apparently impossible for us. Though, by the way, it seems to be taking root here, especially since the time of the religious movement in our higher society. I have a lovely pamphlet translated from French telling of how quite recently, only 5 years ago in Geneva, a villain and murderer named Richard was executed, a lad of 23. I believe who repented and turned to the Christian faith at the foot of the scaffold. This Richard was someone's illegitimate child. At the age of 6, he was presented by his parents to some Swiss mountain shepherds who brought him up to work for them. He grew among them like a little wild beast. The shepherds taught him nothing. On the contrary, by the time he was 7, they were already sending him out to tend to the flocks, cold and wet, with almost no clothes and almost nothing to eat. And of course, none of them stopped to think of repent of doing so. On the contrary, they considered themselves entirely within their rights. For Richard had been presented to them as an object, and they did not even think of it necessary to feed him. Richard himself testified that in those years, like the prodigal son in the gospel, he wanted terribly to eat at least the mash given to the pigs being fatted for market, but he was not given even that, and was beaten when he stole from the pigs, and thus he spent his whole child and his youth, until he grew up, and having gathered strength, went out to steal for himself. The savage began earning money as a day laborer in Geneva, spent his earnings on drink, lived like a monster, and ended by killing some old man and robbing him. He was caught, tried, and condemned to death. They don't sentimentalize over there. So then in prison, he was immediately surrounded by pastors and members of various Christian brotherhoods, philanthropic ladies, and so on. In prison, they taught him to read and write, began expounding the gospel to him, exhorted him, persuaded him, pushed him, pestered him, urged him, and finally he himself solemnly confessed his crime. He repented, he wrote to the court himself, saying that he was a monster, and that at last he had been deemed worthy of being illuminated by the Lord of the receiving grace. All of Geneva was stirred, all of pious and philanthropic Geneva. All that was a lofty and well-bred rushed him in prison. Richard was kissed, embraced. "You're our brother. Grace has descended upon you." And Richard himself simply wept with emotion. "Yes, grace has descended upon me. Through all my childhood and youth, I was glad to eat swine's food, and now grace has descended upon me too. I am dying in the Lord." "Yes, yes, Richard, die in the Lord. You have shed blood and must die in the Lord. Though it's not your fault, you knew nothing of the Lord when you envied the swine for their food and were beaten for stealing it, which was very bad, for it is forbidden to steal. But still you have shed blood and must die." And so the last day came. Limp Richard weeps and all while keeps repeating, "This is the best day of my life. I'm going to the Lord." "Yes," cry the pastors, the judges, the philanthropic ladies. "This is your happiest day. You're going to the Lord." And it's all moving towards the scaffold in carriages and on foot, following the cart of shame that is bearing Richard. They arrive at the scaffold. "Die, brother," they call out to Richard. "Die in the Lord, for grace has descended upon you too." And so, covered with the kisses of his brothers, Brother Richard is dragged up onto the scaffold, laid down on the guillotine, and his head is whacked off in brotherly fashion, for as much as grace has descended upon him too. No, it's quite typical. This little pamphlet was translated into Russian by some Russian Lutheranizing philanthropists from high society, and sent are gratis, free, with newspapers and other publications for the enlightenment of the Russian people. This thing about Richard is so good because it's national, though for us it's absurd to cut our brother's head off only because he's become our brother and grace has descended upon him. Still, I repeat, we have our own ways, which are almost as good. We have our historical, direct, and intimate delight in the torture of beating. Nekrasov has a poem describing a peasant flogging a horse on its eyes with a knout. On its meek eyes. We've all seen that. This is Russianism. He describes a weak nag harnessed with a too heavy load that gets stuck in the mud and her cart is unable to pull out. The peasants beats her savagely, and finally, not knowing what he's doing, drunk with beating, he flogs her painfully, repeating, "Pull, though you have no strength, pull, though you die." The little nag strains, and now he begins flogging her, flogging the defenseless creature on her weeping, her meek eyes. Beside herself, she strains and pulls the cart out, trembling all over, not breathing, moving somehow sideways, with a sort of skipping motion, somehow unnaturally and shamefully. It's horrible in Nekrasov, but that's only a horse. God gave us horses so that we could flog them. So the Tartars instructed us, and they left out the knout as the reminder. But people too can be flogged. And so an intelligent, educated gentleman and his lady flogged their own daughter, a child of 7, with a birch. I have it written down in detail. The papa is glad that the birch is covered with little twigs. It will smart more, he says, and so he starts smarting his own daughter. I know for certain that there are floggers who get more excited with every stroke, to the point of sensuality, literal sensuality, more and more progressively with each new stroke. They flog for 1 minute, they flog for 5, 10, longer, harder, faster, sharper. The child is crying. The child finally cannot cry. She has no breath left. "Papa, papa, dear papa." The case, though some devilishly improper accident comes to court. A lawyer is hired. Among the Russian people, lawyers have been called hired consciences. The lawyer shouts in his client's defense. The case, he says, is quite simple, domestic, and orderly. A father flogged his daughter, and to the shame of our times, it has come to court. The convinced jury retires and brings in a verdict of not guilty. The public roars, convinced jury. The public roars with delight that the torturer has been acquitted. If I'd been there, I'd have yelled out a suggestion that they establish a scholarship in honor of the torturer. Lovely pictures, but about little children I can do even better. Etc., etc., etc. Just keeps going.
Is that the chapter?
No, it just keeps going. You want me to continue?
No. I don't.
It was really relaxing.
It was relaxing.
Yeah, we got into the flow. What's the flog? What's flog in?
Beating with a stick, yeah. It just talks about torturing children.
Yeah, that's horrible.
The angelic truthfulness of the child who has nowhere to turn and no one to turn to. That is what inflames the vile blood of the torturer. There is, of course, a beast hidden in every man. A beast of rage, a beast of sensual inflammability.
Should we look at movies like Tears?
I want to watch this.
I want to watch something, dude.
Alright, peace out, voice memo.
She's